Hello, this is Scott Abels. I'm the president of PrepJet, and for nearly 30 years, I've been working with applicants to help them prepare and pass the licensing exam. In the early years, in the 1990s, I used to visit all of our workshops for our two brands. I would go to various cities throughout the country and I would actually give a lecture on test-taking strategies, which proves the point that you don't need to be a psychologist in order to master a standardized multiple choice examination. I've been doing this sort of work since 1988, and I've worked with people in a variety of fields that have to pass an exam that's quite a bit like yours. And I happen to know that the EPPP, while it is challenging, I think it's challenging because there's a lot of myths out there, and I think that if we can clear up some of the myths and we can focus on what matters and what doesn't, we can increase your odds of being able to pass this exam. In fact, I think you can pass this exam if you're armed with the facts. So let's talk about, first of all, some approaches I share with my clients who I work with at PrepJet. Let's talk about the 6 domains that carry the most weight, the domains that matter more than any of the others. In fact, you could just ignore all the others as far as I'm concerned. Because if you do the math and you master these 6, you'll pass the exam with a nice cushion, I might add. The first one I want to talk about is psychopathology. These are the questions that ask about DSM-5 diagnosis and describe a person's symptoms and ask for the most likely diagnosis. Now, the DSM-5, those questions, there are a few of them. We brought in a team some years ago, I remember, to modify our questions that related to those changes that the APA had agreed to make to the DSM-5. I don't think this is the hardest domain for most applicants. They struggle more with physio questions than the psychopathology questions. But then again, just let me say this is a very large portion of the test. It's a heavily weighted domain. You need to know psychopathology, and we cover it in our summaries. So understanding etiology, prognosis, and other characteristics like gender ratio, associated symptoms, all these things to help you determine a diagnosis for the client that you maybe described in the question. And understanding also that we're going to talk about how psychopathology, physio, and lifespan interrelate. I'll get to that in just a moment. Ethics. Ethics, when I first started at one brand in 1990, and I was president of that brand until 2016, I can tell you ethics used to be the domain where everybody got the questions right. It's straightforward because ethics are ethics. If someone sees a question, for instance, you get a bad review. You know, social media has affected the EPPP. So let's pretend someone gives you a bad review in social media, maybe on Yelp or somewhere on the internet. You know, what can you do? Well, suppose someone were to say something negative about PrepJet. Of course, I would call them. But what if that isn't one of the answer choices? What if the choices are post a rebuttal? Or maybe contact your lawyer? Well, they might give you all these options, but the fact is you cannot violate your client's confidentiality. So perhaps answering, build your own website. Maybe that's not a direct answer, but of the 4 choices, that may be the only answer you can pick. Of course, the answer that would come to my mind on how to respond to a negative review is to call a client. But you see, that's logical. And I'm afraid sometimes the EPPP is not a logical examination. So you have to dissect these ethics questions and understand that there could be sentences in the body of the question that tie back to answers that are wrong. And that's why you need to read the question very carefully. Clinical psychology is the #1 area, I think probably in the last 20 years, why many people do not pass. These are questions that address the different approaches to therapy, especially humanistic, brief therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and family therapy. You might need to know something about different researchers like Miller, Glass, Smith, Howard, and others. So when you see the name of a researcher mentioned in a question or in a summary, you should write that name down. And next to that name, write a couple of bullet points about what that researcher is known for. Cross-cultural terms is an area of clinical psychology where people struggle. If you're not familiar with them, know that you could be asked about one or two, and you should make a list, just like I would make a list of drugs, I would make a list of researchers. I don't like flashcards, I like lists, and you may like lists too. So I have the name of the researcher, and I have what they're known for. I have a list of drugs and what they treat, what disorders they treat. These little things can give you a nice edge. Now, clinical psychology is very challenging. I would say that most of the people who have come to PrepJet who have been unable to pass 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and that's the truth, that's one domain that stands out when I look at the 8 graphs on that letter they get when they fail. And by the way, those 8 graphs are not of equal weighting. The only one that is truly specific to the domain is ethics. So under assessment diagnosis, for instance, there could be 5 domains of psychology that are covered there. So don't, if you have any questions about those graphs, just write me an email at scott@prepjet.net, and I'm happy to look at it. You can send me a screenshot, I'll look at it, and I can actually tell you what happened. Let's also address lifespan development, because that's another area that's part of the Big Six that carries a lot of weight. These are convoluted questions, just like the clinical. They might be telling you stories. They might want to address early biological, environmental influences on development. You may need to know a little bit about Vygotsky or Piaget, language development, attachment patterns, causes of aggression, effects of divorce, remarriage. These things are very important. And again, lifespan, like clinical, carries a lot of weight. You have to master it. Let's talk about physio, because physio, as I mentioned earlier, along with psychopathology and lifespan, what do they have in common? Think for a moment. The brain. Understanding the brain, the various areas of the brain, their functions, the disorders that can affect that area of the brain, and then the drug that is used to treat that specific disorder. Now, I've just covered lifespan, physio, and psychopathology. So the questions on physiological psychology deal with the major functions of the brain areas, and I might suggest you make a list of every area of the brain that you encounter in our exams or in our summaries, and what do they control? Memory, emotion, sleep, cognition. Anything that you see that area of the brain controls, write it down. Just make a list. You may be asked about neurotransmitters, and then the side effects and uses of various psychoactive and antidepressant drugs. Let me also tell you that there's another domain that we have to focus on, and it's the one domain that actually I've had some direct experience with. When I first met the founder of one brand, he had never met someone like me before, he said, so he made me take the MMPI. And I learned a lot from that test. I don't know that he really should have administered it, but it was an interesting experience. Some of you haven't worked for corporations, and I know 1 or 2 very successful organizational psychologists in New York and in New Jersey, but it's an area that really wasn't covered in a big way in most of your undergraduate coursework. And remember that the EPPP is upper division undergraduate coursework. And org psych, well, this is a very challenging area, but here's the good news. The less you think you know about it, the better you are in terms of being able to learn, because the water isn't muddy with other information. Because a lot of people, especially in areas like clinical, lifespan, they know a lot. Unfortunately, what they know and what's on the exam are sometimes 2 different worlds. In org psych, the less you know, the better off you are. And here's why. Because These are questions related to personnel selection. Unless you've worked in HR or done testing of employees, some of this stuff is going to seem brand new. When I used to go to workshops many years ago, I would ask classes, how many of you remember taking an organizational psychology class? And maybe 4 out of 40 people would raise their hands. Well, don't worry. We cover what you need to know, and only what you need to know, in our summaries, in our exams. So your understanding of those topics related to personnel selection, organizational theories, the various types and methods of evaluating employees, selection techniques, job performance measurement, understanding, being able to review cognitive ability tests, work samples, subjective rating scales, all of this is covered, and you will learn this in our materials. Those are the 6 domains that carry the most weight. Now, people worry about stats and research design, and Dr. Horry, who I've worked with since the 1990s, he teaches a statistics workshop for free. And it's free because, personally, I don't think people should pay for something when it only addresses a very small percentage of the test. And I wouldn't worry about it. We only offer it because, frankly, people are afraid of it. What I think they should focus on, though, are the 6 domains I've just mentioned that carry the most weight. You could miss all the clinical, or rather, you could miss all the statistics, but you can't miss all the clinical. If you do the math, again, in most states, you got to get 70% to pass. That equates to about 123 questions in most states. Some states, the cutoff is 75%. But the bottom line is this. You can do this by being armed with, okay, how is this exam structured? And what are they going to ask me about? What should I worry about? What should I let go of? And I've just told you the 6 domains that I remind my clients to focus on. The other thing I want to talk to you about is something that you really should do when you go through practice exams. Now, I came from the world back in the 80s of just keep taking tests. And many people call us and say, you know, I failed the exam 3 times, 4 times. And I said, well, what have you been doing in between exams? Well, I just take more tests. Let me please say, with all due respect, that I know for some time now that taking tests is not how we learn. We learn by reading short, to-the-point summaries that tie back to specific exam items, but more importantly, by writing very succinct notes in our own words. I mean, there's studies that prove that people learn better from their own words than someone else's. So don't rewrite what Diane Edwards has written in our summaries. You know, Diane's been doing this since the late 1970s. And of all the people I have met, and I've hired many consultants, many writers, many researchers for many years, she is the only generalist in the United States, and everything we offer was written by Diane. And she would be the first one to tell you that the summaries actually in many ways are more important to you than taking tests. The world of just taking tests, that's gone. Don't do that, please. Whether you work with me or not, believe me, how you score in an exam is not always an indicator of whether you will pass that exam. Cognitive flexibility comes from mastering concepts, mastering the research, making lists and understanding, here's the disorder, here's a treatment for that disorder. But one thing I really want to stress to you is this. I no longer feel that taking tests is the key to knowing whether you're ready to pass. The one thing that's more important than anything else is your sense of self, your self-confidence. You know, a lot of people need someone to talk to guide them, to perhaps give them a project, to check in with on a weekly basis, maybe put together a study schedule. Well, I do that for an awful lot of people. I've done this for the other brands, for my brand, and I can tell you that structure is important, but you might have a family, you might have work, and you might be working 60 hours a week. You might be working at a federal or county facility or a state facility, and maybe you could only study on the weekends. So we have to be realistic in terms of our strategy to pass this exam. And that is this. Every day we do a little bit. Maybe on weekdays we've worked all day. So at night we're going to review maybe 5 or 6 of our errors on a particular test. And on weekends we're going to read summaries. I want to stress also one last thing. This exam does not define whether you are a good psychologist or not. In fact, I have met so many people in my 30 years in this field, and I know that they're just terrific people. These are people who are saddled with lots of student loan debt. I had one lady I recently was working with. Believe it or not, she'd spent over $10,000 with various brands to pass this exam. $10,000 and 5 years of her life. That shouldn't be the case. And I think that's why Dr. Markovitz decided to form PrepJet, because we knew that there could be a different way to do things. 60% of what we do is reading and note-taking based on short, to-the-point summaries. No puffery. We only teach what's on the test. We don't teach psychology. We teach the test. You know a lot. Our job is to help you either motivate you to modify your perception of research or a concept or a theory so that it works for the exam. In some cases, we have to just learn something to get through the process. Either way, with PrepJet, we know that you can do it. I help people by helping them remind themselves. When I read an exam item, I don't even look at the 4 choices. I formulate in my mind, what should the answer be? I know this answer. I know what they're talking about. So I develop in my mind what the answer should look like, sound like, feel like. And then I look at the 4 choices. And then through a process of elimination, there's 2 right out of the park, they're gone. And then when people say to me, but Scott, I'm torn between A and B. Well, then you're not reading the question correctly. Or you're allowing a distractor sentence in the body of the question to interfere with your perception of what the answer is. Go with your gut. If you believe in your heart that A is the answer, pick it. Don't second guess yourself. You know more than you think. If I can be of any assistance, please write me at scott@prepjet.net. You don't even have to be one of our clients. If I can be of any help to you, because that's what we're about, I'll help you. And so will my team. We are committed to your success. I can assure you, Dr. Markovitz would never have formed PrepJet if he didn't believe that this was the best way to prepare applicants to pass the EPPP. And thank you very much for your time.